Jaya Viswanathan is a neuroscientist and educator, and she's currently with the National Institutes of Health's National Institute for Aging. But the reason why we're here today is because she also happens to be an author and illustrator of a book called Baby Senses, which, let me tell you, it's got some complex ideas, so there's nothing really baby about it. And before we jump into, the depths of her beautiful mind, I want to get a sense of the folks here. How many people here are into the brain? And I'm going to speak louder. Is that better? Okay. How many people here are into the brain? Did you come because you're into brain science? Okay. Yeah, okay. How many people here are for art? Or, yeah, great. What about just community and wanted to get out of the house? Cool. Okay, so I think we'll have something for everybody in these different realms. And I want to start with some of the knowledge. And anybody who can't hear me or Jaya, please give us the indicator, because we want to make sure that everybody can be a part of it. It's recording. We're recording. So I'm going to start with some information from Jaya's book, Baby Senses, and she starts in the introduction. About 3.8 billion years ago, life began as a single-celled organism. And we've evolved, but the cell remains the basic unit of life, and an essential function of life is the ability to interpret the world. An essential function of life is the ability to interpret the world. So ants are doing it, we're doing it. In order to survive, we must sense, understand, and respond appropriately to the challenges in different environments. And one of the things that helps us do that is the nervous system. So let's connect our body and mind for a second. If you're able, touch your hands to each other, okay? If you could put your fingers together or touch your hands to each other. If you're holding a phone or a cup, just notice how that feels. And then take one of your hands and touch your face. And just actually feel your hand touching your face. So it's a really simple action, but a lot is happening here. And this is where Jaya is much smarter than I am. We're deploying the somatosensory system. What the hell is that?
So that's a great question to start off with. And thank you so much for the kind introduction as well, Kate. I really appreciate it. And it's a real honor to be chatting with you today. The somatosensory, somato basically means body. And so the somatosensory system is really anything to feel our body, right? So our bodies, so when we go outside, it's a windy day, so the wind hits our bodies, and then it moves the little hairs on our arms in one direction or another. And so that is a physical stimulus. And the movement of those hair on your bodies, on your head, tells our brains what's happening, that it's a windy day, it's a sunny day. The same thing with temperature. So somatosensory is really a broad term to kind of talk about anything that we're sensing about our bodies and with our bodies in space.
And one of the things I learned from Jaya's book is that we have more touch receptors on our hands and our face than on a lot of other places, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So over millions of years, based on where we need things to be more sensitive, so we have more receptors on our fingertips, we have more receptors on our mouths, our lips. Inside of our mouths, we have somatosensory receptors. Of course, everyone knows about the taste receptors inside of our mouths with which we can taste. But if you've ever had a Slurpee too quickly, your teeth hurt, right? So you have pain receptors in your mouth. You can also, when you have crunchy Ferrero Rocher, or if you have something really soft like ramen, you can differentiate the textures in your mouth, and those are all physical stimuli. So we have these sensors all over on the outside of our bodies, but interestingly, we also have them inside of our bodies. So we have, for example, sensors in our joints that when we're lifting things, it'll tell our brains how much of tension is going to be in your muscles, in your joints, in your tendons, and so on. So again, somatosensory covers a broad spectrum of individual sensory systems that come together. And then if you think about something like spiders, now spiders are really clever, and I know a lot of people don't like them, and there's a reason for that. We're evolutionarily designed to be scared of animals that can cause us harm, like snakes and spiders. But if you've seen like a really big banana spider, they make these huge 6-foot webs, and they can sense a tiny little vibration in one corner of their web because they've got these hair or setae on their legs that are detecting the tiniest of vibrations, and it's localized to the quadrant and the area in which these vibrations are coming from. And so depending on what we as a species and other species have needed to do based on their environment, some animals have really evolved to, exert and have superpowers, essentially.
That's exactly right. And one of the things that I thought was so remarkable to think about, because I don't think so much about neuroscience, but I think a lot about development of self, how we how we have become politically tribal. What is this assertion of identity that we're trying to impose our identity over another person? So I think big, and what was really helpful to me is to get back into the body, into the nervous system, into these sensors. And one of the things you mentioned in the book is that babies use so the touch receptors help us gather information about the world around us, and they help us differentiate self from other. And so if I'm noticing my hand is part of my body, I'm using my hand to touch you or whatever, I can distinguish, okay, this is myself and that's the other. And that's a really key part of how babies develop a sense of self.
Yeah.
Obviously, depending on the security, safety of the baby, the environment around you, that can be challenged or supported in different ways. But that's one of the most primary uses of these touch receptors as you and I were developing, is to develop a sense of self and get to know the world around us. Many, many, many years ago, humans were hunting, gathering, running, hiding, fighting. But they started to evolve. The human nervous system and brain have been evolving since the agricultural revolution about 10,000 years ago.
Yep.
And so we went from kind of the basic touching, exploring self and the world around us to survive, to this magic time traveling thing.
Yeah.
What changed?
Yeah, so you bring up a topic that's very close to my heart. So my doctoral dissertation was on long-term memory. And one of the things that when I was doing my research for my thesis, I realized was that a lot of the same areas in the brain that are involved in past, like when you recall memories and things like that, are the same areas that are often reactivated when you're future planning. And then I got very intrigued by this idea, and the idea is called mental time travel. Interestingly enough, the idea was first proposed by St. Augustine in the 14th century. Of course, they didn't have experimental labs then. Nobody was testing it out. It was a theory that he put forward. But the idea is that the reason that we've evolved to have these complex experiences in the present is so that we can encode complex information that we can use to plan for the future, right? And so the key here is the agricultural revolution was key, as you brought up, is because now suddenly with the changing of the seasons, humans suddenly had to plan months in advance. When do we need to sow the seeds if we want to harvest before the rains, or if we want to harvest after the rains? And then in order to do that, you need to observe the life cycle of the crops. You needed to plan and build some kind of storage so the crops that you do harvest don't go bad before you sell them. And so this kind of necessity is often the precursor to the very, very slow, because evolution, again, happens over millions of years and thousands of years. It's one of the precursors to us developing these very complex kind of constructs in our memories and having conscious experiences.
So if I understand you correctly, essentially, again, the need to survive. We figured out, okay, we can plant crops, we can grow food, we can do this. So our cognitive development evolved so that we could think ahead in the future. And essentially what we're doing is we're creating mental maps, right? We're plotting the future. And I noticed for me, I probably live in the future and in the past more often than I do in the present. I'm constantly thinking, what's next? What do I do now to be what's next? And it brings me out of my body. Like, I actually, when I was thinking about this, and I thought, okay, how can I connect people to their body? Oh, we can touch our hands. And then I was like, oh my God, I have a hand. Right? Because usually it's holding a phone, and so it's just kind of part of the phone. So the mind map is amazing. It's why humans are, top of the food chain. But this engineering mind also brings us away from, as I said, the body and where we are right now, which can have costs and benefits. You, in a way, are tracing your own path backwards or forwards from the agricultural revolution. Jaya studied, not agriculture, but she studied engineering.
Yeah.
And then she moved into neuroscience. Why?
I often ask myself why I became an engineer. I've never questioned the why neuroscience part. So it really started pretty early for me, this kind of confusion about why people are different from each other, right? And so about the age of 8 to 10, we developed this thing called theory of mind, which is the idea that, I think differently from what you may be thinking, what you may be thinking, and that doesn't necessarily need to align. And while most people let it go, I just couldn't. I was like, I don't understand why there's often a quote unquote, and I've come away from this, please do excuse this black and white way of looking at the world. I was a child, I was around 14 when I started thinking about these a little bit more deeply. But I couldn't, I'm like, this is the logical way to do this, right? There's a right and wrong. And a typical example is like when you see bullying in schools, right? You have some people who stand up and do the right thing, and that's the right thing to do. There's no question about that. If you ask people who are bystanders who do nothing, they know that they should have done something, right? So people know, and inherently there's morality in our culture, and we grow up with it from a very young age. But then sometimes people join the bully. Sometimes people bystand. Sometimes people are laughing and gossiping about it and do nothing about it. And so it really bothered me. And at first, I started trying to understand this from a psychology perspective. But over time, over years, I realized that I was very, very interested in understanding the why from a very mechanistic perspective. Like, what's happening? And at that time, like, the brain was considered this black box, right? So we'd done a lot of experiments of like eye movements or fMRI, and even fMRI at the time was very new technology. But we knew there were brains and we knew they were doing complex things, but some things like individual differences in behavior and the reasons behind it were less understood. And so that's what I wanted to do with my life. I grew up in India. My parents are here, I'm very happy to say. Studying neuroscience for me was not an option. There was no course in neuroscience, there's no course in neuroscience. So I ended up doing engineering because I like math. And I figured having a good background in math would help me branch out later, and it has. So that's how I ended up kind of going from engineering to neuroscience.
And you're not alone. This is a part of a long lineage of people. And back in 1879, the German philosopher Wilhelm Wundt, that's exactly how he would have said it. Wilhelm set up the first known experimental psychology lab to investigate sensory perceptions and consciousness. And since then, different people have been trying to understand different species and how they use different senses to perceive information. And right now, one of the ways that you are doing this, your version of Wilhelm Wundt, is you chose to write and illustrate a children's book to understand how different species perceive different senses, to gather information, to survive.
Yeah.
Let's look at some of the examples from your book. Jenna's going to help us. And when we're preparing for that, why children's book?
That's a great question, too. So this started a few years ago. I still volunteer with this organization called Reading Partners. It's a local literacy organization. I highly recommend it. And so what they do is they identify kids who are behind in their reading level and then pair them with one-on-one tutors and we simply read with them. And it's been a fantastic experience for me. And a couple of years ago, I was paired with this really great kid who was very nerdy, so we hit it off right away. And he could not get enough of science books. So every time we had to read together, he was like, can we read a book about ants? Can we read a book about... He was really into entomology specifically, so it was always a different insect. And then one day, it was almost a little bit of a challenge. He was like, what kind of science do you do? And I was like, I do brain science. And then he went, well, can we read a brain science book? And I was a little stumped because I realized there's nothing I actually wanted to read with him on the market. They were all a little bit anatomical. They were all accurate. But a lot of the children's books that you see these days that are fiction, they're very whimsical. They're hand-drawn paintings. They're narratives. They're not factual. But then you go to the other end of like a National Geographic or a scholastic book, and they're photographs and facts. I wanted something that was a blend of the two, and also not shy away, because I knew from my own research and from studying neuroscience that children's brains are like sponges. And I think a lot of people shy away from putting hard content into children's books. And one of the initial feedbacks I had from an advanced reader was, why do you have a reference list in there? Like, it's going to be intimidating to a child. And I said, a child doesn't know to be intimidated. That's an adult perception that we're projecting onto the child who hasn't even come across a reference list yet, because children's books don't have them, right? And so I really didn't want to shy away from it. And after that conversation with Zach, I was like, well, let me see what I can do, because I want to write the kind of book I would want to read with Zach or any other child who came to me and said, I wanted to learn neuroscience, and tell me what's cool about this, and why should I study this when I grow up?
I mean, she's cool, man. So
Thank you.
The pit viper. Mm-hmm. What's cool about the pit viper?
Okay, so the pit viper is one of my favorite animals.
And we might have, is there a slide that specifically shows maybe?
If you escape the thing, there's a folder with the picture of the pit viper.
The pit viper?
I mean, that is the pit viper right there, but
Yeah.
Yeah. So pit vipers are pit snakes, have something called a pit organ. And they actually have evolved this very unique ability to see infrared radiation, and so earlier we talked about somatosensory, and I kind of briefly mentioned temperature sensing. So we have them in our mouths. We have them when we go outside. We can sense temperature through our skin, and we have those sensors. But the pit vipers have taken it a step further, and they can actually see it. And so when they're mapping their world, they're visually mapping in heat and cold. And one of the challenges from an engineering perspective, is that because you're sensing heat, you have to keep that organ cool. And so while humans have tried to kind of replicate that, and now we have, so there's night vision goggles, and a lot of human technology has been based on the way that pit snakes see, quote unquote, infrared wavelengths. It was not an easy solution to arrive at, evolutionarily speaking, but they were able to maintain that organ at a steady temperature while they're able to sense heat. And so they're nocturnal. There's not a lot of light in their environment, and so they've evolved to basically spot a mouse the same size as a rock and go for the mouse, which makes them apex predators, gives them huge advantages in their life, in their evolution. And interestingly enough, so we talk about vision. So it's a bit of a continuum, right? So there are no hard boundaries in biology. And so we see the visible part of the spectrum, or what we call visible, because that's what humans can see. But then there's also ultraviolet radiations that butterflies have evolved to see, right? And so they actually use that in their mating behavior. So butterflies can send signals that only other butterflies can see to ask each other out on dates and stuff. And like their predators, bats, they're not going to be able to see them. And so it's kind of like on a spectrum with the somatosensory as well as visual here. But now there are nanorobots that are based on these kind of heat-seeking principles. Again, not necessarily the same design, but kind of understanding the principles behind how snakes have solved this problem. They built nanorobots that are heat-seeking because tumor cells are warmer than surrounding cells. So these heat-seeking nanorobots will go to the tumor and not affect the surrounding tissue. Yeah.
And the way Jaya makes these incredible points in the book, she has a big index and what did you call it?
Glossary.
But in the pages for the kid, she says, "Mama, mama," said the baby pit viper, "night or day, you always know what to eat and where to hide. How is your aim so sharp?" And the mama snake says, "That's our superpower, snakelet," replied Mama Viper. "Our pit organs let us see beyond light, the infrared radiation which helps us find warmth, food, and shelter, especially at night. We know where things are by seeing their heat." And so you have taken these incredibly complex, sometimes inaccessible ideas and have turned it into a form that a kid can learn from, and I can too. It's like I'm really jazzed by your work. So tell us about the goldfish. And I won't read that one, don't worry.
So the goldfish kind of comes back to the taste receptors. So let me take a step back a little bit and tell you a little bit about taste. So the sole purpose why taste evolved, if you think about it, is so our bodies can tell us to reject harmful food. It wasn't so we can enjoy that hot French fry. Like that was not an evolutionary purpose of it. But of course, it's important, again, to kind of know what's good for you, to recognize that, oh, this is fuel. This is vitamin. This is good for us. And so to recognize that and then associate it with a pleasant feeling so that we keep going for that one, and then to associate possibly or potentially toxic things with a negative kind of reaction. So that's kind of the origin of why people evolved to taste at all. And so taste itself is very complex. It involves smell, it involves temperature. A lot of these receptors for taste itself, they are dependent on the temperature. And so food when it's colder tastes different than it's warmer because those receptors are differentially activated. And so then you have smell coming into it and all of these things. But so humans, we have traditionally called 5, but we have more than 5 senses. If there's anything you take out from this salon, I hope you remember that, like we have more than 5 senses. We've all got superpowers in our brains. But fish, like goldfish, not all fish, because different aquatic species have evolved different specializations to survive and thrive in their environments. But specifically carp, goldfish, catfish, these guys, they have really bad vision. And so they've evolved to have taste buds all over their bodies. And so they actually orient and swim towards food. And if you've ever had an aquarium and you've seen fish kind of go down to the bottom and kind of sift through the bottom, if you ever get a chance to like look at the picture of the inside of a goldfish or carp's mouth, it's incredible. It looks like a conveyor belt. Huh. So if we all take our tongues and feel the top of our palate, you notice that it's got ridges, right? It's got texture, and one of the functions of that is to also help us grind up the food before we swallow it. And so essentially, the bottom of these fish that do what's called benthic feeding, which is feeding along the bottom, it looks like conveyor belts upon conveyor belts of these complicated machinery, but what they're doing is sorting the food from the stones. Huh. And it's literally a machine inside their mouths. And so I was very fascinated, a little bit grossed out, if I may say so, that they actually can taste all over their bodies. Because, if you've been in swimming pools and fish tanks, there's a lot of stuff that's in there that you don't probably want to taste. But anyway, I'm getting off the point a little bit. But so yeah, goldfish have taste buds all over their bodies.
So humans have so much information that we don't know about that you could have explored. Why did you focus on animals?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and thank you for bringing it up. I really appreciate that question. I think one of the things I wanted to kind of remove is this very dogmatic idea in our society that humans have 5 senses. But I also wanted to kind of address the issue of neurodiversity. I think that there are animals that have evolved to do the things that humans can do much better than we have. And I didn't want it to be anthropocentric. I think the idea of including kind of gross and scary animals like frogs and snakes and spiders was very deliberate for me because a lot of animals in our world are now endangered. They're endangered and close to going extinct, and it'll be a real loss because every single animal that you see here today has evolved for millions of years, and they have something special to offer, and it's the same for humans. Humans, even if they're on the spectrum, it doesn't matter if they're wired a little bit differently. Every single brain is very unique, and I kind of wanted to bring a little bit of appreciation by showing these animals that are doing things better than humans can.
You're in good company. Leonardo da Vinci was an artist, an engineer, and a scientist. And thinking about this and talking to Jen about this conversation, we wanted to know how art invites creative thinking and helps you and folks like Leonardo and others in your ilk. How does art help you avoid dogmatic positions that limit scientific exploration?
Yeah, well, thank you for being kind. Leonardo is amazing.
You guys are the same.
Thank you. I'm blushing, but I'm going to let that go. Thank you. So I think I can speak to this from one side because I've always been a scientist since I was very young, but I came to art much later in life. I was in grad school when I started doing art. I can show you examples of some of my early paintings. They did not look good. It took a lot of practice and discipline to kind of, make sure I got in my 3 or 5 hours of practice every week and so on. But I can tell you, having done that, like art, like being good at art, getting better at art has definitely made me a better scientist.
Why?
So for one thing, I think it's strengthened my connection with my body. And I'm going to hark back to what you were talking about earlier about being in the moment versus being, in the future or being in the past. Me personally, I was also extremely cerebral. I was always living in the past or the future. But one of the things art does is bring you to the present, right? You are working on something physical. And then when it's done, it's done. And you have a very small problem at hand, usually a few minutes or a few seconds ahead of you. And it also lets you kind of, at least this is my personal experience, it lets me kind of get in touch with a less verbal, more primitive, more intuitive side of myself. Things like the gut-brain axis, which are not very logical. It doesn't always go to your prefrontal cortex, but it's more of your like instinctual brain that might need an outlet. And so when you get to express those and feel those in a timely manner, it kind of helped me let go of things when they no longer served me better, instead of kind of seesawing back and forth in that mental time travel loop, kind of bring me down and let go of things that don't serve me and focus on things like in my actual task once I was done with the art.
Yeah, and I would imagine too that you're able to look at things actually from different angles, where your grip is a bit lighter, and you can turn and look from a different angle, which helps with problem solving. Absolutely,
and at a cerebral level as well. So there have been studies that show that if you speak more than one language, your cognition gets stronger, your cognition gets better because you're able to connect disparate things because that's how they're set up in those languages. And I think it's the same with any artistic pursuits. So if you see a lot of artists who are able to communicate well, scientists who are able to communicate well, sorry, I meant to say that the other way around. Scientists who are able to really be eloquent about certain things, they're usually involved in some kind of artistic pursuits that help them ground themselves. And in a more tangible sense, I can also tell you, like, before I did art, I wasn't very good at surgery, but once you kind of get that hand-eye coordination down, again, this came with practice, it wasn't overnight, I was actually, getting better at like just having my hands steady and having that hand-eye coordination, like my brain telling my hand exactly where to go, got a lot better with doing things like art. And so I think when you pursue something like the arts, which strengthen your mind-body connection, it will help you in any of whatever your career choices in unforeseen ways. I certainly, when I started doing art, didn't expect it to help me that way. I didn't think it would make me a better surgeon. I was just going there to de-stress and to have something to think about other than the paper I was writing or whatever,
We're going to open it up for questions, and as people begin to think about what they might ask or say or share, I would love you to share what is one thing you'd invite the audience to do to not lose touch with the mind-body connection.
Yeah, I think so. There's a lot of tools and techniques that have been put out there, like meditation, like art that we've talked about today. people, we're all wired differently, every single one of us. But I think it's important to take that time to kind of figure out how you can be in this moment. Maybe it's as simple as, turning on music every day after work for half an hour and just kind of feeling where you are. Maybe with a glass of wine, I don't know. So everybody's a little bit different. For me, I found it in art. Maybe you'll find it in dance. But it's not something that, I was, 25 when I realized that art was doing that for me. It's not something that you always come to easily or instantaneously. But, I think it's really worth a little bit of self-reflection to be in the moment, breathe deeply. There's all these exercises that you can do. And your exercise in the start of today's talk, just like feeling your body, feeling where you are, kind of feeling whether it's a cold day or a warm day. Those kinds of exercises certainly help. But then on a deeper level, you might have an activity, maybe it's collaging, maybe it's making music, maybe it's sitting down with the guitar and playing it. So figure out what does it for you, because it's totally going to be worth it, from my experience.
And start small. Notice that your hand is attached to your body.
Yeah. Before we go to the Q&A, though, I was wondering if, as a journalist, you could share some of your insights on mental health issues and what you think needs to be, or what kind of stories need to be told more. What do you see as being lacking in journalism?
Where do we start? I think there's a huge dearth of accessible information about science.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's, so I focus on mental health and democracy, and how does the individual, the health of the individual affect the collective? How does the health of the collective affect the individual? And I think that mainstream media has made, and the general public has made incredible strides looking at mental health, wellness, trauma. And at the same time, I feel like because we live in a brutal capitalist, country, society, culture, the focus is on how to commodify. So quick fixes. What are the articles that can make you feel better now? Breathing techniques. Here's 5 stretches. Here, test whether or not you are going to live or die in the next 10 years by if you can sit up or down without holding onto a chair. So I think all of that is really important, and at the same time, I think it is superficial, and it's almost like excluding a glossary from a book because you're underestimating what people have capacity for. So, let's put a positive spin. There's so much potential, right?
And can you tell us a little bit about your current project? Because I'm very, very excited about it. So I just wanted to share that with the group. But can you tell us a little bit about invisible threads in your current project?
Yeah. This is my awkward face. So I was with the Washington Post for about 7 years, and I've been in newsrooms for my entire career since becoming a print reporter in Cambodia 20 plus years ago. And the Washington Post, like so many news organizations right now, is grappling with kind of the climate change of media, which is changing audience and advertising dynamics. People don't want to pay for subscriptions because it's all free on social media. There's distrust in the public toward the press. And there is changing technology that is moving faster than a lot of the leadership in news organizations know how to adapt to. And so if anybody is paying attention, and if you're not, that's fine. The news industry right now is in a massive storm of, it's in a bad way right now. So the Washington Post lost $100 million last year, and it cut 240 jobs to try to begin to make things right. We won't mention that Jeff Bezos is the richest man in the world, and owns the Post. But so I was offered a buyout from the Washington Post, and I was one of the people who raised my hands and got it. And so I was able to leave the Post. And one of the reasons why I decided to do it is that after 20 years in newsrooms and covering the Capitol attack and caring deeply about mental health, I recognized that the system I was in was keeping me in a chronic state of burnout, high alert stress, and trauma, whether direct or vicariously through the stories that I was telling. And I went through a process. This is a long-winded answer, but I'll get to invisible threads. I went through a process after being at the Capitol on January 6th and having new trauma wake up old trauma. I recognized that I was addicted to my work, and my whole sense of self and my the value that I considered I had was related to how productive I was, or how good my stories were, or how much reach I had. And I think that that is important. It is a value of mine to empower people and hold people to account. That is who I am through and through. But I can do that in different ways and not measure my worth by the brand, the institution, the job, the productivity. And so I started to begin 3 years ago after January 6th to look at, could I be healthier? Could my relationships be stronger? Could I develop a better sense of self if I wasn't enmeshed with my job? And I think I could have done it and still stayed at the Post, but I didn't want to. So I took the buyout, and I am now working independently on projects that help connect the dots between mental health and democracy. One of the things that I'm doing is a Substack, which is a blog or a newsletter where you have space to write, and it's called Invisible Threads, and it weaves this connection between mental health and democracy. It's in the nascent stages. I'm also a documentary filmmaker, and so I'm working on a project related to mental health and democracy, and have some other things brewing. So it's terrifying and also really exhilarating, because the terrifying part is, how do you make a living? And I don't want to live with the anxiety of being a freelancer and being dependent on, every story that I do. But I'm in the fortunate position when you have a brand like the Post behind you, I'm able to have conversations with people and say, this is what I care about. How can we work together to make sure I can continue to talk about these issues? So it's a whole new world, baby. And it's going to be okay. She said, rocking in her chair.
You're going to be great. I can't wait for content from you. I love your content. So,
are there questions? Yeah.
I have a question. No, it's fine.
Okay.
I think I can speak loudly now. I have a question. I was intrigued by your comments about the senses. I think humans have 5 senses, right? In popular culture, there's this notion of a 6th sense. I think there was a restaurant in Georgetown years ago called The Sixth Sense or something. The Sixth Senses, right? Right. So when you, in your research, when you look at animals and you talk about the goldfish with tasting sensors on its back, it gives me the creeps. But right? That is incredible. So how many senses are there? Is it infinite?
That's a great question. Yeah. So one of the things I talked about is that there are no boundaries. And so it might, at one point, come down to how do you define a sense? Like, what is a sense by itself? There are tadpoles that have a sense to sense the current, the direction of water currents. So they're not swept away and they die, right? And so, but it's the evolutionary precursor for a lot of the senses that we see that are hair-based. So for example, our vestibular system, it's basically a bunch of hairs sticking into a gel, and also our cochlea. And so when sound waves of a certain frequency hit it, it activates that particular hair cell. And so these tadpoles sense, is it a separate one? Yes, because in a certain way they're physically they're a little bit different, they serve a different purpose. But again, they were the precursor for a lot of these hair-based sensors. My book isn't really meant to be an exhaustive list. There are only 16. There are animals that live in tidal regions that are actually responding to tides. So tides, but also lunar cycles. So tides are dependent on the cycle of the moon. And then of course there's circadian rhythms. So we have sensors that tell us how much light is in our environment, and that's why sometimes we feel sleepy when we're jet lagged and things like that. And then of course we're still trying to understand this gut-brain connection that I mentioned earlier, where essentially it's symbiotic relationships with all these bacteria that are living in our gut, but they've been shown to affect mood. They've been shown to be modified, like the colony, right, of like one species versus another that are in our guts. They can influence our susceptibility to disease. And so because the sense, the ability to sense is such a fundamental part of biology, and we have internal environments that are being sensed and external environments that are being sensed, and as we develop newer and more advanced technology and mathematical computational abilities, we don't really know what we might find with the ability to look at something in a new way. And so, yeah, that's a great question. And there's still more species that have not been discovered. There are these worms that live very close to hydrothermal vents in the bottom of the sea. And what's really amazing about them, it's pitch black. Most of the time, there are these clouds of sulfuric and other gases that are coming out with all these toxic chemicals, because it's coming from the core of the earth with molten metals and chemicals. So their visibility is zero. But beyond that, they still need to sense their environment. They still need to sense danger, but simultaneously protect their own bodies from the harm of these chemicals. And so every neuron in these little worms and these little animals is protected, but they're still able to sense minute changes in their chemical environments. There are these worms that are the cousins of the C. elegans worms, which are very widely used in research. And they're completely blind, and they still are able to biologically signal each other while they live in these blackout caves. Again, under the water, and to mate with each other. They're able to send biological signals. So, I mean, to me, it's a fascinating world to keep an eye out, and see what's new.
Thank you.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi, really nice presentation. One question that's not necessarily related to sensory, but I'm a musician turned neuroscientist.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that has been percolating through my mind, not just the arts, but also, arts, music is art.
Yeah.
Right? So I was wondering if you could comment on how
Yeah.
music and art might affect healthy aging,
Yeah.
as well as the cognitive decline, of people who are aging.
And I'll just repeat the question for anyone who might. How does music and art affect aging, or help to potentially reduce the cognitive decline of it?
Right, yeah. But also healthy aging. How does
Healthy aging.
healthy aging and cognitive decline?
So that's a great question. So my PhD was long-term memory of sounds. So I do know a little bit about this. And there have been a lot of studies that have shown cortical thickness of your temporal cortex of your auditory areas increases when you play music and when you become an expert in things. So in neuroscience, there's this kind of idea of cortical real estate, but also like the more like neurons that fire together. So the more you use something, the stronger the connections become. And so with respect to healthy aging, so the research, to my knowledge, is still ongoing. So there's still a lot that we can find out about how these things work. But by making these cross connections, just like language, just like doing art or music with your physical body, it brings you into the moment. And it strengthens connection. But if you know more as a musician, I definitely welcome your comments as well.
One of the things I'm thinking of is not necessarily playing music,
Mm-hmm.
but listening to music.
Mm.
Especially classical music.
Yeah.
One of the things I learned, when I was an early career faculty person trying to write grants, is that if I listened to the Bach, Brandenburg concertos,
Yeah.
it really helped me, to synthesize my writing.
Yeah.
Because of all the structure, and I know there has to be some sort of plasticity in the brain
Yeah.
that works for it.
So that's a really interesting point, because we are, as humans, we're really, really good at picking out when things don't fit into a harmonics. And so our brains are very good at detecting anomalies, if you will. And so the theory for how music can put you into certain emotional states is that it does kind of the rhythm of the music. So again, the research on this is a little bit young, I would say, because music itself is so complex. You have rhythm, you have harmonics, you have all kinds of lyrics if you have them. And all of those affect individuals differently on an emotional level, but the basic rhythm of the music can also entrain your ongoing oscillations in your brain. So in our brain, we have ongoing oscillations to make our movements smooth. We have ongoing oscillations at certain frequencies when we're awake versus when we're asleep, when we're conscious versus when we're unconscious. And so people are trying to figure that out by probing it using all these different technologies. To me, I don't personally see that I have a full picture yet, but I think that's what makes that field of music and neuroscience so exciting. And I certainly do try to look out for articles that are being published in that space.
I was going to say I play the harp, and it's an extremely difficult instrument. And I picked it up later. I played it and then dropped it because I had to work. And I'm almost 70 now.
Yeah.
And the thing is with the harp, because it's so difficult, you kind of have to play it by heart almost.
Mm-hmm.
And it's incredible as you get older, the more you play by heart, the more you can. And so it develops your brain. And this is what I would say. If you're older, learn an instrument, but learn to play it by heart. Because if you're just going to play it like that, that's not going to do the type of work. To learn to play pieces by heart takes
work.
Difficult.
Yeah.
And you have to make a lot of brain connections. And so I think that's the key. If you really force yourself to learn to play by heart, although your brain is really going to be, and you have to memorize all the time. So that's what I would say anyway.
That's great. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Playing the harp isn't easy. That's amazing.
But your brain develops.
Cool.
And your emotions too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the phrase "playing by heart."
Well, yes, actually it's funny.
Yeah.
Right?
It's
Yeah.
true. It's actually you're playing with your.
You're playing with your mind, but you're feeling it too.
One last question, so I'll give you a softball question. So while you were writing the book, all the research, what was your favorite animal and why?
Okay.
And I'll find it while you talk about it.
So honestly, my favorite animal was the bees. Were the bees. And so it's because when I was reading about them and doing my research, so bees are social insects like ants, and so their behaviors are fascinating because they're individuals, so they can behave as individuals, but they also behave as a whole. And so they're very, very interesting from a biological and evolutionary perspective. And before I did my research on the bees, I had always assumed that it was very stereotypical. A queen would die, and then another queen would take over. And so a lot of their signaling are through pheromones. But turns out that's not the case. So this really blew my mind. So when a queen dies and a new queen takes over, the hive can collectively decide to reject her. And so they actually overthrow the queen and install a new queen, which to me suggests a level of autonomy to the workers and the other bees that I had not previously thought was possible. Huh. But it's really like it's a decision that they collectively make because it's based on how genetically related they are, the new queen is to the rest of the hive. So there is a decision level just based on genetics, but for whatever reason, the hive can be like, we like this queen. Let's not overthrow her, or let's do a little Game of Thrones here and see who comes out on top. So that's why I thought that was really cool.
We have elections coming, so that's very
I know, right?
Yeah. You can find Jaya's book. You can look at copies of it on the back, and there are also cards and bookmarks where you can buy it, and if that's of interest to you. And I want to just say, you might look and say, gosh, that's an investment. Well, yes, it is. It's an investment in yourself. It's an investment in the mind-body connection and connecting with our world and helping people wherever they are approach it and carry the messages forward. So, Jaya, thank you so much for doing what you do.
Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful conversation.
Yeah. And thank you, Jen, for creating this space and for everybody here for filling it.